Welcome back to Around the Museum with Joe and Diane. It's great to have you with us, and we're still kind of in the realm of dinosaurs, but we're sort of moving on to a slightly controversial topic, particularly amongst the world of creationists at the moment, which is it's interesting that it's become this hotly debated. But we're really talking today about feathered dinosaurs, which is not a new concept, and it ultimately stems back to this idea that dinosaurs evolved into birds. So before we get into feathered dinosaurs and some of the debates around feathers and stuff, we've actually got a fossil here, Diane, or rather a cast of a fossil. Yes. This is the original one in the Berlin Museum. It's known as the Berlin Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx comes from the Jurassic Solnhofen about 159 supposed million years, right in the middle of the Jurassic. And it's supposed to be one of the best examples, or at least it used to be regarded as one of the best examples of a transitional fossil. That's a fossil of a creature that is turning from one type of creature into a different type of creature, i.e. dinosaur to bird. So why was it regarded as a transitional fossil, and who really first suggested that this could be a dino to bird evolution evidence?
Well, this all goes back to Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, because he was the one who mainly promoted the theory of evolution to the general public and to the academic world as well. And it was his contention that dinosaurs evolved into birds. And when this particular specimen was found and others like it in the same deposit, he thought, aha, there we are. We have something that clearly has feathers, and no one doubts that it has feathers, but it's not like a flying bird that we have today. So it is an odd-looking creature.
So specifically, we've got claws in the wings, and we've got teeth in its mouth, which makes it an unusual bird. It's got a long bony tail as well, which is sort of the three distinct unusual things about it. But none of these three things are exclusive to Archaeopteryx, because we have modern birds that have claws on their wings. Every bird starts out with at least one tooth.
That's right.
And we have some sort of semi-teethed birds today and bony tails. So none of these things are strictly unique to Archaeopteryx, but because all of these features came together in this unusual bird, it was then claimed to be a transitional fossil. Now, before we even get into feathered dinosaurs, I believe it was the Natural History Museum that did a lot of the original research on Archaeopteryx to answer this question of was it a transitional fossil or not, and what was their conclusions about whether Archaeopteryx was a bird, a dinosaur, or something in between?
Well, their conclusion was it was a bird. Now, they have another original specimen, and we now have modern techniques where we can take very, very detailed scans of its head structure.
Like the internal brain.
The internal brain structure, its inner ear, and things like that. And they came to the conclusion that this thing had literally had a bird brain and bird's ears. So it was a flying bird.
So is a bird's brain different from that of a reptile's then?
And yes, it is. In fact, there's been a lot of research into birds' brains recently, so that if someone calls you a bird brain, it's no longer an insult, which is rather nice to know, because bird brains are different to reptile brains and to mammal brains. They're just wired differently. They are very complex, and particularly they're very complex in terms of the motor control, that's the muscle control, which is needed for flying. Yeah. Because of any pilot will tell you, you need an awful lot of really clever computer power as well as an intelligent person flying the plane in order to sense the changes in the movement, in the balance, and all of those things, and then to make the subtle changes that are needed to keep a bird in the air, just as like keeping a plane in the air. So bird brain has all of those.
So even though it was originally regarded as a transitional fossil, and it was suggested it was used as one of the main pieces of evidence by Huxley to promote this idea of dino to bird evolution, something which Richard Owen, who actually owned the Archaeopteryx specimen in the Natural History Museum, was vehemently against.
Oh, he was main opponent of Darwin.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So even though it was originally regarded as a transitional fossil, originally used as evidence of evolution, particularly dinosaur to bird evolution, it's now regarded by scientists as not only not being a transitional form, but not even being a feathered dinosaur.
No,
It's a bird.
it's a bird.
An unusual bird.
It's an unusual bird, but it's in a kind of its own.
But we know that there's lots of now extinct birds that we find in the fossil record that are clearly birds with fully formed feathers and bird morphology and bird brain. And they're no longer here, and several of them are unique and unusual. And we have sort of large extinct running birds as well, like the moa and the elephant bird and stuff that we know about.
Yes, that's right. And there are fossil birds that have teeth, and there are fossil birds which are fully formed birds which have been found in rock layers that are at least outdated by the evolutionists as being as old as this one.
And so, that's the other really important thing, I think, as well, is that is to realise that this is a fully formed bird, even by secular evolutionary standards. And the argument is that around 160 million years ago, dinosaurs began evolving into birds. So this is sort of in the middle of the Jurassic. And yet by 159 million years, so 1 million years later, you have fully fledged, fully formed birds, i.e. Archaeopteryx, right, in the fossil record.
Yeah.
Now, bear in mind that it supposedly took 2.5 million years to turn apes into humans, and apes and humans are supposed to be 98% genetically similar, right? Now, we're not getting into that figure yet, but just going by purely secular standards here, apes and humans are supposed to be really, really similar, 98% similar, yet it only took 1 million years to turn a cold-blooded, fully scaled dinosaur into a fully formed bird according to their own date. So something doesn't quite line up with their dating methods there in that argument.
No, it just doesn't work out. There are too many changes to go from a ground-dwelling reptile with no aerodynamic features and with no brain control, nervous system control in order to use them, to go from that creature to something which has all of those features like Archaeopteryx.
And these aerodynamic features don't just consist of the feathers and the brain. It's also like your entire breathing and circulatory system, the way your blood flows, and you have to have a special formed set of lungs in order to cope with this kind of flight and breathing pattern, which reptiles just don't have.
Yes, and birds are warm-blooded, so they're very metabolically active. So there's lots of changes involved in that in terms of the blood circulation.
Yeah. Okay, well, so we're dealing with the original one, Archaeopteryx, which clearly is a bird, not a transitional form or evidence for evolution, as was claimed by Huxley and many people since then. So now we're getting onto this subject of feathered dinosaurs, right? And we'll talk a little bit about the controversy, but if we see on the screen here, Diane, we've actually got in our Creation Research Museum collection some fossil feathers entrapped in amber. So what is amber? How have we got them entrapped here?
Well, amber is fossilized tree resin. You see this in pine trees. If you cut a pine tree or damage it, a whole lot of resin comes out of it, sort of thick, sticky goo. Yes. So now this is now solid because it's been buried. So fossilized just means buried, basically. So this is buried, preserved tree resin, which is now as hard, not quite as hard as glass, but getting close to it. So it's solid. Now, because it's sticky goo, when it comes out of a tree, it just will roll down the side of the tree, and it will entrap whatever happens to be in that same vicinity, sort of resting on the tree.
Insects,
leaves. Bugs, leaves, little bits of vegetation, whatever just happens to be lying around there. And this comes from a place called Burma, where there's masses and masses of this. It's just as if a whole forest of pine trees was just smashed to bits. And all this amber with all the tree resin was just scattered everywhere, and so it just picked up whatever happened to be lying around in the forest. Yes.
Okay, so it's a great, and this is Cretaceous. So around the 90-odd million year kind of time frame for it. So right in the middle of the so-called dinosaur era, right? Okay. And we actually have on the screen now some feathers that have been trapped in this amber. Now, when we got these feathers, the claim was that these were dinosaur feathers. Right? And the argument for them being dinosaur feathers is that, well, this is in the middle of the Cretaceous, rather, the middle of the dinosaur era, and the majority of creatures with feathers would have been dinosaurs. So the assumption is that these are dinosaur feathers, right? Based purely off of the idea that that's...
purely on the date that's been considered.
So, all right, going on to this claim of feathered dinosaurs then, do dinosaurs have feathers? Or are the feathers that we find on dinosaurs even feathers? Because looking at this, it's clearly a feather.
That's clearly a fully formed feather with a central rachis and the little barbs. So if you didn't know the context and just showed someone a picture of that, oh yeah, that's a feather.
And a feather is a really complexly designed apparatus for flight.
Yes.
And
amazingly complex.
And this is more than just your sort of downy feathers or your sort of fibrous feathers. You get slightly strange birds like the New Zealand kiwi, or even your Australian emu and the ostrich, which has slightly unusual feathers in the sense that they tend to be very long and fibrous. But these are, just by looking at them, flight feathers.
Yes, this is a flight feather. It's got that tight structure that we're seeing little barbules that are tightly bound together.
Okay. So have we ever found any undisputed dinosaur fossils with this quality of feather on them?
No. Wherever you find dinosaur skin that is undisputably skin of the dinosaur that it's found associated within, it is clearly reptilian.
Yeah.
There are no fully formed complex feathers like that.
Okay, so what about claims of dinosaurs that are feathered, things like Sinosauropteryx, which looks, for all intents and purposes, a dinosaur? It doesn't have a bird's morphology, it has a reptilian morphology, it has reptilian features, it is a small dinosaur by pretty much everybody's definition, yet the claim is that it has these fibrous-looking filaments around its body which have been interpreted as being feathers. So what about the case of, like, Sinosauropteryx? Are we dealing with a feathered dinosaur here?
No, you mentioned the word filamentous. In other words, sort of hairy-looking bits. And if you look at this fossil, yes, it is clearly a dinosaur. No one disputes that. But around the edges, it's got a fine sort of hairy areas on its back and on its tail. And the feathered dinosaur proponents looked at this and they said, oh, this must be the first step to going from flat scales or slightly raised scales like a reptile has to feathers which actually project out of the body and project upwards. And so they are sometimes referred to as dino fuzz, right? But in the professional literature, they're called filaments. Now, a filament just means a very fine fibre, in other words, like a bit of string.
Yeah.
And so you have to think, well, are there any other sources of stringy stuff that you could get in dinosaur skin? Remember, these have been buried and preserved.
And most of them give evidence of having been drowned.
And most, yes, they do.
Yes,
and
features.
This dinosaur has those features. So if something's been buried in a whole lot of wet sediment, well, its skin is going to be rather knocked about a bit and fragmented a bit. And, of course, underneath skin, you have lots of collagen fibres that we talked about in one of our previous programs. Now, by collagen fibres, it really is stringy sorts of stuff. And inside your skin, it forms a sort of felt-like meshwork. Now, it's the same in all vertebrate skin. You've got this felt-like meshwork, and so that could easily start coming apart, and you would have a whole lot of fine fibres.
Yeah. So we're not clearly dealing with something that's not obviously or abundant evidence for being feathers. Certainly not in the case of some of these feathers that we have in our collection, where they are clearly fully formed flight feathers. So do we have any examples of something which is half scale, half feather? Because the argument is, well, you know, scales are made up of predominantly keratin, a bit like our fingernails, right, in reptiles. Well, feathers are also predominantly made up of keratin.
Yes,
so surely if they're made up of the same thing, one could evolve into the other. That's the argument that's used. Now, there's lots of problems with that argument, because the one thing that's missing from all of feathers or scales is a outside source of intelligence to turn something which is a base material into a feather, which can't happen by itself. But do we have any evidence of half feather, half scale kind of structures, or has everything that we've found, can it be categorized as either this is clearly a scale or a decayed scale, or this is clearly a fully formed feather, whether it be a downy feather, whether it be a flight feather, or whatever?
No, we've only got the filamentous sort of stuff, or we've got things that are clearly feathers. Now, even the emus and the flightless birds, their feathers have a distinctive branching pattern. They're still obviously feathers that you don't get with these dinosaur filaments. You don't have that branching and interlinking.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you go to like the the Natural History Museum in London, you go down and you find that there's these wonderful Velociraptor models, right, which are just now covered in these feathers, right? And in fact, we actually have a feathered Velociraptor fossil in our Creation Research Museum collection over in Australia. Do you want to share a bit about the story about how we got this feathered Velociraptor skeleton?
Yes. Well, when we opened the museum, of course, Velociraptor is a very well-known and popular dinosaur because it stars in the movies, and we were able to order a cast of the original Velociraptor specimen as it was found. Now, it's also found in that drowned position, and so we thought that would be useful. So we ordered from the professional cast maker a Velociraptor cast, a museum quality one, and it arrived, but it actually had impressions of feathers. And we had seen the original photos of the original find from the professional literature, and it does not have feathers.
Yeah.
So we contacted the people who made the cast, because they are professional cast makers. They make things for professional museums. And we were told, we have to put feathers on them now because that's what the places who display these want.
Right. So it's scientific fraudulence, really, at its greatest. Is just making up information and data for the sake of supporting current thinking in science, which really has no evidence for it. Because have we ever found any Velociraptor feathers?
No, there's no evidence that they have.
I think that the closest that the argument goes is that they found a single nodule on a Velociraptor bone, one Velociraptor bone, I guess, to add. There's been lots of things found that they don't have this. There's a nodule which they have potentially interpreted as a potential quill point where the feather could and then compared it to turkeys. But when you actually compare the two, there's no real comparison there. It's one single mark on one single Velociraptor skeleton, which has not been found in any of the other Velociraptor skeletons and has no real indication of being a quill point.
No, there's no connection with anything. It's just, as you said, it was an isolated bone. It wasn't a whole skeleton.
Yeah.
If you look at the whole skeletons, not a sign of a feather anywhere. And all it is just a tiny little bump. And I mean tiny. We're talking about millimetres here. Birds that have strong flight feathers do actually have sort of little nodules on their bones because the feathers are tightly anchored into their wings and attached to the bones to give them stability. And so it's a leap of imagination that these tiny millimetre-sized little nodules were flight feathers when there were no feathers in sight, and they look nothing like the actual quill knobs, which are quite substantial and arranged in a distinct pattern.
Yeah. And in fact, it was our good friend, Professor Andy McIntosh, who made a comment on this, because we can comment on it from the biological and the geological perspectives. But he actually made a comment that there's another significant issue with feathered dinosaurs, that being the thermodynamics of them, in the sense that if you get a cold-blooded reptile, and there's very little good evidence that these dinosaurs were anything other than cold-blooded. If you get a cold-blooded reptile and cover them in feathers, you're going to have a big issue with overheating, with the thermodynamics, with the way that they are able to kind of function. So it doesn't even make sense. Then you see arguments that, they must have been, if they have feathers, then they must have been warm-blooded, which is an assumption upon an assumption, because you're assuming they had feathers first of all, and it's all based on the grand assumption that they evolved into birds.
Yes. So as you say, it's assumption on assumption. You're starting off with a worldview or a belief by faith. Right, dinosaurs turned into birds. As going back to Huxley, he had no evidence for it, and there's still no evidence for it 150 years later.
And I remember I was listening to a lecture with a scientist once who was working on British dinosaurs, and he'd covered all of his large theropod dinosaurs, so like the big T-Rexes and the T-Rex type dinosaurs, in feathers. And I'd asked him, I said, so, I know there's a lot of debate over feathered dinosaurs, and there's a lot of claimed small theropod dinosaurs with feathers, right? Like Sinosautrix and the like. But I said, as far as I'm aware, there's been no evidence of feathers on these large theropod dinosaurs, T-Rex and the like. I said, so where has the idea of covering these dinosaurs in feathers come from? And he said, well, we assume that these large theropod dinosaurs had feathers because we know that dinosaurs evolved into birds. Well, you don't know, based on an assumption. So again, it's another assumption upon an assumption. And you're really just getting nowhere. You're building your entire mindset and philosophy about dinosaurs purely based on A, no evidence, but B, just a essential assumption that they evolved into birds, which really there's no evidence for at all.
Yeah, it's classic circular reasoning. You start with your idea, go around in a circle, come back to it.
Round and round you go. All right, well, what about this? There are a lot of claims, even amongst creationist literature, that, we don't agree that dinosaurs evolved into birds, but there's lots of evidence now that dinosaurs had feathers. Where do we draw the distinction between a creature that has feathers, whether it clearly has feathers, like this so-called dinosaur feather that we have here at the moment? Where do we draw the distinction between, okay, this is clearly a feather, do we classify it as a dinosaur, or do we classify it as a bird? Because we do have modern examples of large running three-toed birds, like, ostrich, Rio, that kind of thing, the cassowary as well, of flightless birds that are running birds that do have fully formed feathers, but they're still classed as birds.
Yes, and there's a famous fossil one called Caudipteryx. Yes. And the interesting thing is, when that was first found, we wrote in one of our newsletters that this looks like a modern-day running bird, but it did have a distinct feathery tail. And a few years later, published in Nature, very highly prestigious scientific journal, was a study of the skeleton of this particular bird, and they worked out you can tell from the biomechanics, when you've got a whole skeleton which is articulated, what sort of movements it was capable, and this thing was capable of being a long-range runner. So one to us. But yes, you have within the category of birds, there are different bird kinds. No one disputes that. But they are birds from the beginning. They were made as birds from the beginning. Some of them were always meant to be running birds. Some of them have died out. Some of them have survived. But they have multiplied after their kind.
And so a warning, and we should be wary of anybody who tries to use a secular evolutionary definition of a dinosaur or a bird, particularly when it comes to feathered dinosaurs or birds, which are based ultimately on that assumption that they evolved into birds and changed into birds. We should be wary of anybody who uses that same logic and tries to apply it in a biblical sense, because you will find that it just doesn't fit, and you end up having to walk the evolutionist line of changes and warm-blooded dinosaurs and feathered dinosaurs, and before you know it, you're stuck with something that sounds very much like an evolutionary history of the world. So we should always be wary of anybody who is using secular mechanisms and secular assumptions and trying to apply it in a biblical way, because we end up with, let's face it, ridiculous concepts such as feathered dinosaurs and warm-blooded dinosaurs, and really none of this has any evidence for it.
No, it doesn't. So always start with Scripture, know what Scripture actually says, and then don't be afraid to check out the real science. In other words, what has actually been found, not just the story that's being told about it. But if you start with biblical worldview, you can then discern the difference between what's the actual discovery and what's the story that's being told about it.
Now, we do have a number of questions about feathered dinosaurs, which have been published on our Ask John Mackay website, so you can find that at askjohnmackay.com, or you can go to creationresearch.net and then click on Q&A. And you mentioned also a report with Caudipteryx earlier.
Yes.
How do people find that report and similar reports like it?
That's in our fact file, which is an archive of our newsletter items where we just keep a watching brief on the science news. And so if you go to that, you don't have to know when the newsletter was sent out. You can just do a keyword search on particular topics, so feathered dinosaurs, Caudipteryx, and you'll find a little report there with the original references. And we've also made a creation conversation.
We have indeed, yes. We've got a creation conversations, and we actually have a special playlist on our YouTube channel which deals specifically with feathered dinosaurs. There's a whole series of them on there, Creation Bites, which are the little snippets. So go and check out the feathered dinosaurs playlist. We have a whole creation conversation specifically on feathered dinosaurs. Sign up to the newsletter so you get the straight up-to-date information about feathered dinosaurs as soon as it comes out in the secular world, and search the Creation Fact File and have a look on the Ask John Mackay site. It's all available on creationresearch.net. So do go and check that out there. So thanks for that, Diane. We're going to continue working our way through all of these pieces of amber here and seeing if we can find more examples of these beautiful feathers like this. But feathers themselves really do show the glory and genius of God's design. So I think we should do a flight special to finish up things.
Yes.
All right. We will catch you next time, folks. Goodbye and God bless. Watch Creation Research TV, a live 24/7 broadcast of everything Creation Research. Available for free on our YouTube channel and through Creation Research Live. Check out Creation Research Live, our all-new streaming service for creation research, with thousands of free resources and access to all of Creation Research's premium documentaries, debates and presentations through a low-cost monthly subscription. Find out more at creationresearch.live. Support Creation Research through tax-deductible giving in many countries. Find out more at creationresearch.net. Be sure to sign up to the Creation Evidence News. Regular updates and news from the world of creation research, science, and the latest evidence for creation. Why not visit one of the many creation research museums around the globe? Find out more at creationresearch.net. Got questions? We've got answers. Check out askjohnmackay.com to see Q&A articles by experts from around the world. See also the creationfactfile.com website for latest evidence news from creation research.